Cancer cells don't grow well on just any fuel. There's actually a specific internal environment they prefer, and some of the most ordinary foods in your kitchen right now are quietly helping create it. I know cancer is a word that can bring up a lot of fear, and I want to be upfront about something before we go any further. Genetics and chance both play a real role, and no food list can promise protection from that. But research consistently shows a meaningful portion of cancer risk is influenced by the daily environment inside your body. Things like inflammation, blood sugar patterns, and hormone signaling. And those are areas where your everyday choices genuinely matter. That's the part I want to focus on with you today, not to scare you, but because it's actually one of the more hopeful parts of cancer prevention. You have more influence here than you might think. I think about a patient of mine who came in after a routine physical, completely healthy, no red flags on paper, but genuinely scared after reading an article online listing cancer-causing foods. What she needed wasn't a list to fear, it was context. The actual mechanisms behind why certain patterns matter and others don't nearly as much. That's exactly what I want to give you today. If that idea resonates with you, go ahead and subscribe now and stick with me until the end, because I also want to walk through red meat specifically, since that topic gets flattened into scary headlines far more often than the actual research supports, and I think you deserve the fuller picture. Let's start with something that surprises a lot of people, and that's sugary drinks. And I don't just mean soda. Sweetened coffee, fruit juice, and energy drinks all belong in this category too. Here's why they matter so much. Many cancer cells behave differently from normal cells in how they use fuel. Healthy cells convert nutrients into energy fairly efficiently. But many cancer cells shift into a faster, less efficient pathway that burns through glucose rapidly, almost like an engine stuck at full throttle, and they specifically prefer glucose as that fuel. On top of that, when you drink a large amount of sugar quickly, especially in liquid form without any fiber to slow it down, your body releases insulin, and insulin doesn't just manage blood sugar, it also acts as a growth signal, telling cells to divide. Some cancer cells actually carry far more insulin receptors than healthy cells do, meaning they respond even more strongly to that signal. This is one reason large studies following populations over time have found associations between higher fruit juice intake and increased risk of several cancers, even though the juice itself feels far more innocent than a can of soda. There's also a separate concern specific to fruit juice and certain rice products, which is trace arsenic contamination, something the American Cancer Society has specifically flagged as worth moderating, particularly apple juice and frequent rice consumption. If rice is a regular part of your diet, a simple habit of soaking it overnight and rinsing thoroughly before cooking can meaningfully reduce that exposure. We're right around the 3-minute mark now, and if this is the kind of clear, research-backed explanation you've been looking for, I'd really appreciate you subscribing, because there's an entire category of food coming up that hides behind a health food reputation. That category is ultra-processed food, things like packaged snacks, most breakfast cereals, and frozen convenience meals. These products are engineered to be extremely palatable, which is exactly why they're so easy to overeat. But beyond the calories, they tend to spike blood sugar rapidly, which reinforces that same insulin signaling we just talked about, and they're linked to chronic low-grade inflammation, which can quietly weaken your immune system's ability to catch and clear abnormal cells before they become a problem. There's also a more subtle issue here, which is displacement. Every time ultra-processed food fills your plate, there's less room for the whole foods that would have otherwise supplied fiber, antioxidants, and the nutrients your immune system actually depends on to function well. And this compounds over time. It's rarely one meal that shifts your risk. It's the accumulated pattern, meal after meal, year after year, that gradually shapes the internal terrain your cells are living in. Salted and pickled foods deserve a mention too, particularly if they're a daily habit rather than an occasional one. High salt concentrations can irritate and damage the stomach lining over time, and that repeated irritation has been linked in research to a meaningfully higher risk of stomach cancer, especially in regions where these foods are a dietary staple. Now here's the halfway point, and this next part is the one I think gets misunderstood more than almost anything else in nutrition, so I want to slow down and walk through it carefully with you. Processed meat, things like bacon, sausage, hot dogs, and deli meat, has one of the more consistent links to cancer risk that we see in the research, largely because of nitrites and nitrates used in curing, which can form compounds called nitrosamines in your stomach that are capable of damaging DNA. But red meat on its own, the unprocessed kind, tells a more nuanced story, and I don't think it gets talked about fairly. The evidence linking unprocessed red meat to cancer is real, but noticeably weaker than the evidence for processed meat. And there's an interesting detail that I think changes how you should think about it. In one study, participants who ate a substantial amount of red meat daily saw a rise in a marker linked to DNA damage in the colon. But when researchers added a modest amount of resistant starch, a type of fiber found naturally in foods like potatoes, legumes, and slightly green bananas, that increase in DNA damage disappeared entirely. What that tells us is that red meat's effect seems to depend heavily on what else is on your plate. If it's crowding out fiber-rich foods day after day, that's one environment. If it's paired with them, that picture looks quite different. My honest, non-alarmist take is this: red meat every single day probably isn't the healthiest pattern. But red meat once or twice a week, especially alongside plenty of fiber, isn't something I'd lose sleep over. There's one more piece worth knowing, and it's not about what you eat, but how you cook it. Grilling, frying, or charring meat at very high heat can form compounds capable of damaging DNA. The fix here is refreshingly simple. Partially cooking meat before it hits the grill shortens its time over high heat. Marinating with herbs, garlic, or vinegar has actually been shown to reduce formation of these compounds. And choosing leaner cuts means less dripping fat and less smoke settling back onto your food. So if I can leave you with one thing today, it's this: none of this is about achieving a perfect diet, and it's certainly not about fear. It's about understanding that your body's internal environment, the inflammation level, the blood sugar pattern, the balance of what's on your plate, is something you actually have meaningful influence over, one choice at a time. My patient I mentioned earlier didn't overhaul her entire diet overnight. She simply swapped her daily orange juice for whole fruit, started pairing red meat nights with a bean or lentil side dish, and left it there. Small, sustainable shifts like that are genuinely what the evidence supports, far more than any dramatic elimination diet ever could. That's not a small thing. That's genuinely empowering. If this helped you see this topic a little more clearly today, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me for the next video, where we'll keep building on exactly this kind of practical, evidence-based understanding together. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon.